My mother despises my wife because she cannot have children, and reminds me of this at every family holiday. My mother stood in front of everyone at Thanksgiving dinner, her wine glass raised high. A toast, she announced, smiling wide. To family. And let's hope next year, someone here finally makes me a grandmother. God knows it won't be from you too. I met Laura, my wife, when we were both in our late 20s. She worked as a marketing director at a tech company, and I was running a small design firm when I brought her home to meet my family after 6 months of dating. My mother was smitten. She's a breath of fresh air. My mom gushed to me after dinner that night. You better lock this one down, or someone else will. Things were great, at least at first. My mom treated Laura like the daughter she never had. They'd go shopping together, share recipes, and even binge-watch TV dramas during Sunday visits. It was the kind of relationship I had always hoped for when I imagined bringing someone into the family. When Laura and I got married 2 years later, everything seemed perfect. But that illusion cracked the moment we started trying for kids. We tried naturally for over a year before seeing a specialist. It wasn't until a few painful tests and consultations later that we received the news. Laura was infertile. I remember the way she cried in my arms that night. I told her it didn't matter, that I loved her regardless, and we'd explore other options, adoption, surrogacy, whatever made her comfortable. But what I didn't anticipate was that the real challenge wouldn't come from us. It would come from my mother in the beginning. My mother adored Laura. She would introduce her to everyone as her future daughter. And during the wedding planning, they were practically inseparable. My mom would call Laura to help pick out floral arrangements, sample cake flavors, and even plan the seating chart. She joked that our kids were going to be the most beautiful, smartest grandkids ever. I thought I had hit the jackpot, my wife and mother getting along like best friends. For a while, it really seemed like Laura had found a second mother in mine. My mom would send her little gifts, homemade jams, knit scarves in the winter, even family heirlooms like a pair of earrings she had worn in her own wedding. Laura was glowing from the warmth of being embraced so fully into my family. When Laura and I announced that we were starting to try for children, my mom was over the moon. "You've made me the happiest woman alive," she said, tears in her eyes. "I can't wait to spoil my grandkids rotten." But that excitement turned into awkward silence after the doctor's diagnosis. When we shared the news with my parents, my mom's smile faltered for just a second before she masked it with a tight-lipped grin. "Oh, I'm sure there are other options," she said, voice light but distant. "Let's not jump to conclusions yet." At the time, I didn't think much of it. My father gave me a comforting pat on the back and reassured us that family meant more than biology. My mom nodded along, but her enthusiasm from before was gone. Laura cried quietly on the car ride home, but I promised her that we'd figure it out together. Still, there was something about my mom's reaction that didn't sit right. I told myself she just needed time to process the news. But I was wrong. A few weeks after we shared the diagnosis, the shift in my mother's attitude became impossible to ignore. Gone were the random phone calls to Laura to check in or invite her to lunch. The thoughtful gifts stopped. My mom, once eager to spend hours with Laura picking out fabrics or planning holiday dinners, suddenly had no time for her. At first, Laura thought it was her imagination. "Maybe your mom's just busy," she told me one night as she folded laundry. "She hasn't been herself lately." But then came the comments. We were at my parents' house for dinner one weekend when my mom casually dropped a line that made Laura go pale. "It's a shame, really," she said, passing the salad bowl. "I always thought I'd have little ones running around this house by now. But life doesn't always turn out how we want, does it?" Laura didn't respond, just clenched her napkin under the table. I was about to speak up, but my mom moved on like she hadn't said anything out of the ordinary. My father gave me a glance, a silent warning not to cause a scene. From there, things escalated. My mom began making offhand remarks about how fast time was slipping by, or how hard it is for men to wait forever. One evening, while Laura and I were cleaning up after dinner, my mom pulled me aside and lowered her voice. "You're a good man," she said. "You deserve a family. There's still time to find someone who can give you that." I froze, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "What?" She placed a hand on my shoulder, like she was offering me some sage advice. "I'm just saying, you don't have to tie yourself down to a life without children. You have options." My stomach turned. She wasn't just suggesting I consider adoption or surrogacy. She was suggesting I consider leaving Laura. I pulled away from her grip and went back to the kitchen without saying a word. I didn't tell Laura what my mom had said that night, but something told me she already knew. The breaking point came during my aunt's 60th birthday party, a family event filled with laughter, music, and the smell of barbecue wafting through the air. Laura and I were trying to enjoy ourselves, but I could tell she was anxious. Family gatherings had become a minefield ever since my mom's comments had grown bolder. I was at the drink station pouring us both glasses of lemonade when I heard it. My mother's voice, loud enough to turn heads, cutting through the chatter like a knife. "It's such a waste," she said to my cousin. "Michael could have had 3 kids by now if he had married someone else. Remember Michelle? Oh, she was lovely. Always wanted children. But instead..." Her gaze landed on Laura, who was pretending to focus on the appetizers, her hands trembling slightly. "Well, things don't always go as planned, do they?" The blood drained from my face. I didn't even realize I had clenched my fists until I felt my nails digging into my palms. My cousin shifted uncomfortably, glancing between my mom and Laura like she wasn't sure if she should intervene. I marched over and placed the lemonade down harder than I intended, causing a few drops to splash onto the table. "We're leaving," I said, grabbing Laura's hand without waiting for a response. My mom looked taken aback, but she didn't apologize. Instead, she smiled politely, as if she hadn't just humiliated my wife in front of half the family. "Don't be so sensitive, Michael," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I was just reminiscing." I didn't say anything. I led Laura to the car, and as soon as the doors shut, she broke down. Her sobs were the kind that left her breathless, her face buried in her hands. I felt like I'd failed her, like I should have done more to shield her from this. "She hates me," Laura whispered between sobs. "Your mom hates me." I pulled her into my arms, but no amount of comfort could undo the damage my mother had just inflicted. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this continue. My mother had crossed the line, and I wasn't going to stand by and let her tear my wife apart piece by piece. The next morning, I called my mother and told her I needed to talk to her in person. When I arrived at my parents' house, my dad was sitting in the living room watching TV, but he quickly got up and left when he saw the look on my face. My mom sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee like she wasn't the cause of last night's disaster. "I'm not here for small talk," I said, sitting across from her. "We need to discuss what you said to Laura last night." She sighed, setting down her mug. "Oh, Michael. You're being dramatic again. You know I wasn't trying to hurt her. You humiliated her in front of the entire family." "I didn't humiliate her," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "I just stated the truth. What's wrong with being honest about the fact that you wanted kids and that dream's slipping away? It's not your place to bring it up," I said firmly. "Especially not in front of everyone." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm your mother. If anyone should be concerned about your future, it's me." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "What you're doing isn't concern, Mom. It's cruelty. You keep bringing up Michelle and making Laura feel like she's not good enough. Don't you see what you're doing to her?" She didn't respond right away, and for a second I thought maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand. But then she shook her head. "I'm only saying what everyone else is thinking," she said, her voice cold. "You're wasting your life with a woman who can't give you what you want, what you deserve. I know you love her, but love isn't enough when you're missing out on having a family. And if you won't say it, I will." I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. "You're asking me to leave my wife, the woman I love. I'm asking you to think about what's best for you," she said softly, as if she were offering me advice out of love. But there was no love in her tone, just selfishness disguised as concern. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Laura is my family. With or without kids, she's my future. If you can't respect that, then we have nothing left to talk about." My mother's face hardened. "So you're choosing her over your family?" "I'm choosing her because she is my family," I said, turning toward the door. "And until you can understand that, don't expect to see much of me." I didn't give her a chance to respond. I walked out, slamming the door behind me. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. My phone buzzed with a message from my dad. She didn't mean it. You know how she gets. I ignored it. I had heard that excuse too many times before. When I got home, Laura was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, staring blankly at the TV. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and puffy. I sat next to her, pulling her into my arms. I talked to her, I said softly. She nodded against my chest, her breath shallow. What did she say? The same thing she's been saying. But it doesn't matter anymore. I told her that until she can respect us, she won't be a part of our lives. Laura sat up, her eyes searching mine. You really said that? Yes. I meant it. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I worried that I had made the wrong choice. But then she exhaled and leaned into me, her body finally relaxing. Thank you, she whispered. I've been so scared that you'd choose her over me. Never, I said, kissing the top of her head. You're my wife. My family. And I'll protect you from anyone who tries to hurt you, even if it's my own mother. We spent the rest of the evening in quiet peace, but deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. My mother was too proud to let things go, and I didn't expect her to suddenly change overnight. But I was done hoping she'd come around. Over the next few weeks, my mother tried calling me, leaving voicemails saying I was being unreasonable and tearing the family apart. She even reached out to some of my cousins, hoping they'd convince me to talk to her. I ignored it all. Then one night, Laura and I were having dinner when my phone lit up with a new message from my mother. This time, the tone was different. If you want to abandon us, fine. But don't come crying back when she leaves you. Women like her always leave. I put the phone down without responding. Laura noticed and asked if everything was okay. I smiled and reached for her hand. Everything's fine, I said. And for the first time in months, I truly believed it. I didn't hear from my mother again after that message. The silence stretched for weeks, then months, and eventually, a full year passed without a word. At family gatherings, she avoided me entirely, and I was happy to return the favor. My dad would check in every now and then, but it was always brief, surface-level conversations meant to avoid stirring any deeper issues. In that year, Laura and I focused on rebuilding ourselves. We explored adoption agencies and surrogacy options, but for the first time in a long while, we weren't rushing the process. We gave ourselves permission to just be, to find happiness in the life we had without the weight of my mother's expectations crushing us. One afternoon, while Laura was working in the garden, I received a call from my dad. His voice was hesitant, cautious. Your mom wants to see you, he said. She says she's ready to talk. My first instinct was to say no. After everything, I wasn't sure I wanted to give her another chance. But part of me, maybe the part that had always wanted her approval, decided to go. I didn't tell Laura because I didn't want her worrying. When I arrived at my parents' house, my mom was waiting in the living room. She looked older, more tired than I remembered, but her eyes still had that same sharpness. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. I heard you're thinking about adoption, she said, folding her hands in her lap. I nodded. We are. There was a long pause. Do you really think that's enough? That you'll be happy without real kids of your own? And just like that, I knew this meeting wasn't about reconciliation. My mom hadn't changed. She was still clinging to the idea that biology was everything, that Laura's worth was tied to what she could or couldn't give me. I stood up, my heart pounding. This was a mistake, I said. I thought you wanted to fix things, but you don't. You just want control. But I'm done letting you have that. She rose to her feet, her expression hardening. You're throwing away your future for a woman who's holding you back. You'll regret this, Michael. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. No, Mom. The only thing I regret is letting you hurt Laura for as long as you did. I walked out without looking back. When I got home, Laura was sitting on the porch, her hands dirty from planting flowers. She looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. How did it go? I sat down next to her and smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. It's over. I said goodbye. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we watched the sunset in peaceful silence. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by the idea of my mother's approval. I had everything I needed right here. I wasn't just choosing Laura over my mother. I was choosing the life we were building together. And for the first time, I felt free.